Good afternoon and welcome to the show. I'm Jim Flyzik. During today's show, we will discuss critical issues facing government and industry leaders in securing cyberspace. With me on the show today are Christopher Lowe, the Associate CIO at USDA's Agriculture Security Operations Center, Dr. Ron Ross, the Senior Computer Scientist and Information Security Researcher at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Sam Chun, the Director of Cybersecurity Practice at HP Enterprise Services, Ed White, Senior Director of Civilian Business at McAfee, and David Egts, the Principal Architect at Red Hat. Let's get in and talk cybersecurity. It certainly is a hot burner topic these days. It's for my opinion, it's about time. It seems like a long time we've been band-aiding problems, and it seems now we're moving more to proactive. But let's start by talking about priorities for the year. Let's start with Dr. Ross. Ron, what are some of your key priorities for the upcoming year in cybersecurity?
Well, Jim, this is a real big year at NIST. We've got so many important things going on, but the top three in my book, we're finishing up first is a risk assessment guideline. This finishes out the fifth in the series of 5 publications we've been working on with the Defense Department and the intelligence community since 2009. Secondly, we have a major update coming in our security control catalog, the 800-53. It's going to be revision 4, and we're covering a range of new topics from insider threats to industrial control systems to cloud computing, mobile computing, and we're adding a new privacy appendix, which is something we've never had before. And the third priority, which probably is one of the most important ones, is a new systems and security engineering guideline. We're trying to move from the patching day-by-day mentality to building, more resilient systems from the start. And that really gets back to an architectural and engineering approach. So this guideline will be coming out in 2012, changing the fundamentals of how we really protect our information systems and manage risk.
Yeah, terrific. I know those pubs have been invaluable over the years in providing guidelines and trying to do some standardization across government. They're really important. Ed White, how about over McAfee? What are some of the priorities you have for supporting the government customer and in helping them get where they're trying to go?
Well, obviously, that's a daily activity for us. I would say that the biggest three that we're focusing on right now are going to be around the mobile space, around database security space, and around cloud in general. Obviously, you've got concerns on each one of those. Many different issues as subsets of those, whether it be, securing the data in the mobile end, securing the cloud, and how the data is actually going to be secured across the board if it's in multiple places. But one of the big ones that we're seeing gain more traction is on the database side with database security. Obviously, that's the first place that everybody's going to go and attack because that's where you store your most important information, right? So you got to make sure that that's going to be secured, and hopefully, in conjunction with the recommendations that NIST and other organizations are carrying forward, we're going to be able to support that across the board.
Yeah, the data and data at rest is a big deal, and especially as you look at cloud and everything else, that's going to be important for a lot of priority on that data. Sam Chun, how about over at HP? What are some of the priorities you see for the upcoming year that you're trying to get accomplished over there?
Well, Jim, one of the things that about my appearance today is that this is my 4th appearance on the show in the last 3 years, so it gives me a little retrospective insight on the priorities that have changed over time.
Right.
I think one of the things that's very striking and noticeable for us is that we are, as a nation and as a government, entering somewhat of an age of austerity. And there's increasing pressure on agency leaders to focus on IT activities, including security, that has the most amount of impact on the mission of that agency. For security practitioners like me and our group within HP, that's an extremely challenging requirement to work through, mainly because security is a risk management activity. And actually, if you listen to Dr. Ron, it's a 3-tiered risk management activity. But even if you do security absolutely well and do it absolutely correctly, the systems that people use pretty much act the same. So it's really hard for practitioners to demonstrate that value. So what do we do? One of the things we're focusing on is how do we reduce the capital burden of our agency leaders in dealing with security threats. The threats aren't going away. They're going to increase. But the budgets we don't see increasingly going up for our agency leaders to meet those threats.
Right. It'll be a challenge.
It'll be a very big challenge. And one of the ways that we want to be is that all the capabilities that we have over the years that we've acquired, how do we make those things consumable by our customers in a way that aligns with their kind of the changes in budget. That's a lot of words, but a simple way of saying is sometimes you need tools to do a house project. You can go to Home Depot and buy a hammer, but you won't always need to buy a bulldozer. Sometimes you can use them. So making that transition of capital-intensive activities for security, making some of that transition into an OpEx activity is a big priority for us. And we're launching a lot of the services, security as a service, managed security service that's going to be important for our customers.
Yeah, I think that is important. I mean, the ROI for security has always been tough because we all know security costs in a lot of different ways. It costs money, of course, but it also costs in terms of performance, and might user friendliness might not be quite as as great with a lot of security. But on the other hand, when you look at the cost of not securing systems, it's a significantly different question, and the idea of being an agency of trust. I think if you're seen as having good security, you'll be seen as a good agency or a good place to work and a place to be trusted, and a place where the customers of government will view that agency as being a positive influence in terms of who they're working with. Let's talk to Chris Lowe at USDA. Chris, I make my way around town quite a bit, and I've been hearing a lot of talk about how far Ag has come, Department of Agriculture in security, and it's good work. I'm sure you have to be part of that yourself. But what are some of your priorities for the upcoming year?
Well, thanks. We've definitely been, I think, turning around USDA and our approach to security. One of the big changes that actually goes back to when Chris Smith, our CIO, came into the office was a change in philosophy to try and create operational security at the departmental level. USDA is made up of 27 component agencies and offices, and previously, operational responsibilities were held at that level, and just the compliance and reporting was to funnel up. And really, to try and get our arms around some of the emerging threats and the persistent threats that we're dealing with today, you have to be aware at that enterprise level. So one of our big priorities this year is developing that common operating picture. We've just completed an equipment deployment for the first time. We've got a set of internal sensors to actually start aggregating data. That's kind of a near-term thing because we were operationally fairly blind to what went on inside, only seeing things as they crossed our borders. So that's a big change for us. Now the challenge is how do you consume that data that's coming in? How do you bring all those pieces into some meaningful reporting structure? And that's as much a technology challenge as it is a staffing challenge. We've got our team at the department, but we've also got all the operational teams within the agencies. We're trying to reach out and bind those into a common workforce, sharing the same tools, the same processes, building that same awareness within those teams that they can take to their own management chain, saying, here's what the threats are, here's what's happening to us, here are some immediate and longer term steps we need to take. A second priority is really kind of leveraging what we're getting out of the security tools. Yes, we are trying to drive the security business, but we're also, for the first time, able to provide insight into some of the other operational issues that go on. So we've done work around looking at enterprise licensing. For the first time, we can come up with realistic numbers of what are the major software titles, where are they deployed, bring those together, and then turn it over to a procurement process to drive down the costs overall. So in terms of trying to prove an ROI, there is always that challenge. But
consolidation, especially when you have a lot of components, if you can pool them together, there's a strong business case for that.
Absolutely. It's a huge opportunity.
And I'm sure they all just get on board right away,
Absolutely. So licensing and the consolidation itself, we're pushing hard on the data center consolidation and the security models around that. Our email migration, we're at 73,000 mailboxes and still on track to have the entire department by the end of this FY.
Fantastic.
So it's going to be huge.
Oh, good. Look forward to following along, and I know Chris, and I like to follow along with him, see how things are going there too. But there's a lot of things. I hope the debt debates and things like that are not going to slow things down because there are so many positive things going on. We hope that the funding will continue for a lot of these positive efforts. David Egts over at Red Hat. When I think of Red Hat, I think of open source. And that's another thing. If you go way back to the beginning of open source, people thought, oh boy, open source, they'll have a lot of security issues. Now I think people view it completely different. It's done a complete turnaround that with open source, since you can see the bits, source code, you can secure them. And all of a sudden, I think we're seeing a whole nother paradigm around open source being a good way to secure systems. But anyway, David, what's some of the priorities for you?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Jim. Well, one of the things that we've been focusing on since the very beginning is our openness and our transparency from the very beginning to make sure that we don't hide behind binaries and we make sure that we develop the best products possible. And as opposed to getting the product out there and then doing security as a bolt-on afterthought.
Right.
So as a result, there are three things I wanted to talk about today that are some of the priorities that we're working on. The first one is certification. So for those who have been following Red Hat for a while, that Red Hat Enterprise Linux is one of the most evaluated operating systems on the planet. It's been Common Criteria evaluated 13 times on 4 different hardware platforms. And our new flagship product, Red Hat Enterprise Linux 6, is undergoing Common Criteria certification again, and we hope to have some good results in the upcoming quarters. And not only is it just for the operating system, but it's the virtualization component as well. So that'll be really, really encouraging. So we're targeting EAL 4+ with both the operating system and the virtualization. The second thing that we're really focusing on over the short term is shortening the accreditation times. We've been one of the challenges that I see with my customers is that they're not security experts by trade. They're either IT guys that are in the data center, or they're in a Humvee in Iraq and they got to get a server going. And the problem that they run into is that they have a mission that they need to execute on. They need to be secure, but getting from point A to point B is really, really hard for them. So some of the things that Red Hat has been really, really working hard on with NIST and others in the government is the U.S. government configuration baseline, or USGCB, which helps shorten those times by taking the policy from a 3-ring binder to something that is automated and machine readable and very reproducible. The third effort that I wanted to mention is our cloud security strategy that we're working on. And the cornerstone of that is a technology called SVIRT for secure virtualization. And it's built on top of SE Linux, which is something we worked with the NSA. NSA started it back in 1999. We helped them make it open source and mainstream as part of a commercial operating system. And we're extending that technology to being able to use the power of NSA-grade SE Linux to confine virtual machines. And that's built into our Red Hat Enterprise Linux product today, as well as it's going to be in our enterprise virtualization product in the next couple months.
Right, all great points there, and key things that are challenges that people are talking about. The challenges coming about because of virtualization, because of cloud, because of things like that. And and I think the accreditation, and as you're mentioning, that issue is going to get even more severe if you take cloud to where people are thinking it's going, where all of a sudden there's going to be apps popping out there and you're just going to download them to use them. I mean, if they all have to be certified before they're downloaded and used, we're going to have a problem, especially when the kids get older and they become the workforce and they're so used to just going out there and grabbing them. So it'll be an interesting world to watch. Let's switch to and talk about some specific areas. Our listeners always like to hear about some specific things that you think are where we're making real progress. Let's start with Chris Lowe this time. Chris, what are some specific areas at USDA where you think you've really made some progress this past year and where things are really starting to happen?
Well, I mentioned the sensor array, the equipment deployment we were just wrapping up. I mean, this is exciting from a technology standpoint. We've got close to 4 terabytes of raw data coming in now on security events across USDA. Take that back to a year ago today, we had nothing. Our reporting at that time was all manual based on agency interpretation. That's a huge step forward. At the same time, we've got a framework in place to start rolling in some of the other operational data from other tools that were not part of the original security focus, but already exist. Not only like I said, agency technologies, but some of the service requirements we've written into the networks. As that comes online, there are some managed services we are moving into that. Ultimately, I think security, we'd like to be out of the hardware business. Right, we don't need to own the boxes that are doing the work. We just need the data. Right, and really the fabric of the network is what needs to be that reporting tool. So that's where we've got a roadmap lined out that we're moving forward on. Right. Also, we've done good work in getting kind of the awareness levels up in terms of outreach to our executives. As a civilian agency, you're kind of challenged that not everybody holds clearances or even has necessarily the understanding that USDA is an interesting target for adversaries. Right. why us? We're just farmers, right?
Right.
But USDA, it has just an amazing suite of different activities and business areas, from loan systems to women and infant feeding,
Right.
Laboratory work, food safety.
Yeah, well, absolutely. A lot of
Yeah.
personal data to protect, a lot of sensitive data. Yeah,
Absolutely,
cool.
millions of customers that we're dealing with.
Yeah, terrific.
So,
All right, sounds great. And Sam, you brought up that conversation with executives, I think, and I think Sam was onto something there with risk. It works better to talk to senior executives about managing risk than it does about information security. I mean, they relate to managing risk. But Ron Ross, what do you think some of the key areas where you've seen specific progress made over the last year?
Well, with all the debate about FISMA and the back and forth that's taken place over the last several years, we've made some terrific progress in many areas. I think that the top 2 or 3 that come up in my mind, first is the Joint Task Force transformation that I've been involved in with the DoD and the intelligence community. It wasn't too long ago that we had 3 different sets of security standards and guidelines for the federal government, one for the intel community, one for the Defense Department, and one for the NIST constituents. Now we're bringing those all together under one umbrella, a standard unified framework for cybersecurity. That's a great thing for the federal government. It's great for our contractors. We kind of have a single playbook now we're working off of, which really is going to help us build, operate, and maintain more secure systems. The second thing I would note is that the core NIST standards and guidelines under the Joint Task Force now with our partners are going through a fundamental transformation. We've re-engineered our entire certification accreditation process. It's now much more attuned to the near real-time ongoing authorization, continuous monitoring. And really it's a question of retooling our fundamentals to make sure that we are in the operations tempo cycle of the adversary. These cyber attacks are very sophisticated. They're being developed daily, and we've got to have the tools, techniques, processes, procedures, mechanisms in place to really build more secure systems. So there's been great progress, and I think we have a lot more things to come over the next year or 2.
Yeah, I agree, and I think, at least in all my years of bringing around the subject, it seems like, cybersecurity has reached a top priority in just about everybody's agenda, and it's taken a long time to get it there, but hopefully now the progress will continue to pick up. Let's turn to David Egts. David, what are some of the areas where you've seen progress really being made and demonstrated?
So I'd like to build upon what Ron was saying. I know Ron has been doing some outstanding work along with the rest of the folks at NIST in terms of helping to shorten those accreditation times, which I was saying earlier is a really big pain point for a lot of customers that we have. And one of the other areas where we've been working with NIST is on the USGCB, the U.S. government certification baseline. And it stems from the FDCC, or the Federal Desktop Core Configuration,
Right.
where before it was this really big manual process I was saying, where you pulled out the 3-ring binder with your security policy, and then you have a human that goes through and locks a system down, and then you present it to someone to say, yeah, is that good or not? And you could see that one is that doesn't scale very well as you move into virtualization and cloud computing, where you have possibly thousands of virtual machines that you need to lock down. The second problem is that it's very prone to human error. You type in the wrong thing or you overlook something, that could be bad. And then the other challenge that you have too, like what Ron was saying, is that everybody had their own standard of locking down systems, whether it was DoD or
Right.
Intel or the civilian agencies. And so what the FDCC and then now the USGCB is trying to do is try to consolidate that.
Right.
And Red Hat has been fortunate to have a seat at the table to provide vendor guidance as far as working with folks as to getting people together to figure out the best ways to lock down systems. And the way that that's being done is using a technology called SCAP, or the Security Content Automation Protocol. So it takes that 3-ring binder of knowledge, consolidates that into a machine-readable document that can be played out on a system to have it lock itself down, and also audit itself to see if it's locked down properly. And this is the first time ever that we have this common objective language that I think is really going to transform how government is doing security. And tying that into some of Ron's work with 800-37 with the continuous monitoring of security controls, that's going to be even more and more important to be able to send out demons to go and
Right.
check on systems, and then report back, and to do that continuously instead of waiting for a 3-year cycle to check your security.
Yeah, terrific. Great stuff there. And I want to hear from Ed and Sam on this same subject, but first we have to take a short break. You're listening to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM. Welcome back to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM. I'm Jim Flyzik here with Chris Lowe from USDA, Dr. Ron Ross from NIST, Sam Chun from HP, Ed White from McAfee, and David Egts from Red Hat. We're talking cybersecurity. When we went to break, we had heard from some of the panelists about specific areas where progress is being made. I want to hear from the others. Let's start with Sam Chun over at HP. Sam, what are some areas where you've seen real progress being made in this space?
I think one of the most important progress that I've observed over the last couple of years is that we've really fundamentally changed the discussion of security from defend everything, defend perimeter, spend as much as you can until you run out of budget to enforce that security, into a lot more sophisticated discussion around risk management.
Right.
What are the systems? What are the networks? What are the functionalities that are important to you as an organization, and how to prioritize our investments around the things that are important to you as an agency. So I think that's a critical thing, especially in the kind of the budget age that we're entering right now. From a more technical level, I think one of the big enabling things that we have that deployed government-wide is the use of smart cards. HP is the largest provider of smart cards to the federal government. We issue all the DoD common access cards, as well as the vast majority of the HSPD 12 cards. And it holds enormous potential as a way to do things like multi-factor authentication, machine-to-machine trust. So I think those are two really promising areas and important areas in the times that's coming.
You know, I think you make good points there, really focusing on what really needs to be protected. I remember back my Treasury days talking to Secretary Rubin, and there was a number of websites being hacked. The homepage and so the secretary said, well, we don't want that to happen to us. And I remember having a conversation with him. No, we don't, but we also don't need to spend an enormous amount of money because there's no data there. There's nothing there. And we can reconstruct that literally in a matter of minutes. So we might be embarrassed for a couple of minutes, but that's not where we need to spend the money. We need to spend the money protecting the real data that needs to be protected. So it's an interesting discussion. Ed White, McAfee, where's some of the areas where you see real progress being made, Ed?
You know, the one thing that everybody today is kind of brought up individual points that relate back into an operationalization of security best practices, right? We have to get away from throwing point products at problems. We actually have to look at how do we operationalize our we'll call it response, if you will,
right,
to allow us to be better protected in a proactive manner. Right. So one of the things that we've seen and we've been driving forward over the last 2+ years is basically embedding industry expertise in the operational components within the government agencies, right? So JTF, ITC, for example. So all the JTF initiatives that are going on, whether it be FBI, DHS, NSA, DOD, have industry involvement, whether that's industry only McAfee or whether that's industry across the board, so that the government has insight to what industry knows, right? For everybody to be protected, for everybody to be able to be protected well, they have to have as much situational awareness as they possibly can. So they have to absolutely drive best practices into an operationalized component to allow us to be able to achieve that end state goal. So I think right there's a lot of that happening. We're driving those relationships, we're driving those solution sets forward in a more tactical manner. The second side of the house, I would say, would be some of the farther reaching, if you will, arrests that have been made in the areas of cybersecurity that we haven't seen in a long time, right? You know, Restock botnet, for example, was taken offline. Anonymous and Luxec have their own issues and had their own arrests associated to them. The PayPal hackers, 14 of them got arrested, and those were only in the last 6 to 8 months. So we're starting to see a transition away from we don't know who's attacking us to we know who's attacking us. We have the ability to give attribution to the community of interest, i.e. the FBI or whomever it might be, to allow us to be able to get where we want to go. So those are kind of some of the points from a progress perspective that I see over the last.
Yeah, I'll tell you that issue in the law enforcement side of the equation, that's a whole other radio show, and one we should probably do sometime, but I did participate in a DHS cybersecurity event a few years back, and they had FBI, Secret Service, and others talking about just how difficult it is to do some of the prosecutions, and largely because of the lack of evidence and the fact that a lot of them are coming from overseas and things like that. It's a whole fascinating set of issues to talk about as perhaps another subject someday. We talked about progress. We talked about some specific examples of things happening. Let's talk about some of the big challenges that are still there, things that we got to still overcome to get where we want to go. Let's start with Dr. Ross. Ron, you're in the middle of these issues every single day. What are some of the big constraints or challenges yet that you're trying to overcome to really get where you want to go?
Well, there's a lot of challenges. We've made a lot of progress, but still a lot of challenge. I want to pick up on what Sam and Ed talked about, managing risk and operationalizing security. I think one of the things we see today is we're kind of in a mentality where we're chasing one vulnerability after another, and they keep on coming in greater numbers. And I'm trying to, in the new 800-39, we're trying to change the whole way we do risk management and cybersecurity by starting with a strategic risk management approach. And what this does is it allows you to establish your priorities and trade-offs, assumptions, and risk tolerance, and then moving very quickly into managing complexity. We have a lot of IT today, and a lot of the difficulty we have in building more secure systems and infrastructure it's a lot of complexity. So being able to manage that complexity really talks to a very strong enterprise architecture and systems engineering approach. And you're going to see the NIST focus over the next year or two is going to be much more on the area of building more secure systems from the start. And then doing that will reduce the number of vulnerabilities on the back end of the problem. Also using technology wisely. We have the greatest private sector in the world, and we produce great technology. But we have to be careful in how we deploy the technology. We've got to really understand, as Sam talked about, what are the risks of deploying a specific new technology. It may be great productivity-wise and supporting the mission, but what risks do you bring in to the mission space by doing that? So those are some of the challenges we still face.
Yeah, I think that complexity issue is one, when you just even start thinking of the thousands of products and thousands of kinds of software, and it's just overwhelming, in terms of when you try to pick, and then you think of the skill set you need to understand all of that complexity and all that. It really does present a really unique challenge for everyone. Chris Lowe, what do you think are some of the big challenges you face daily? Some of the things that are, the sort of the hard things you still got to get done in order to get to where you want to go?
Well, we've got a couple. Picking up on what Ron was talking about with risk management, one area we've identified as a challenge is trying to build some sense of that into our procurement cycle. Mm-hmm. When agencies are spending, large money on projects, or even what they think are routine upgrades, trying to make that somewhere in that cycle there's a reality check that whatever the upgrade is, you're introducing new vulnerabilities potentially, or at least you're impacting the overall risk fabric that the agency is dealing with. That's a real challenge. At the same time, getting the mechanisms in there to do some of the basics of security in every vehicle as a routine reflexive habit.
Right.
We're not there yet.
Right.
Another challenge is just the overall fluidity, whether it's clouds on the back end or mobility on the front end. The shadow IT of my own personally owned device brought into the agency, mm-hmm. Or the customers wanting to use whatever it is that they're bringing to bear at that time. There's just this whole sense of we need to be able to do what we need to do when we're doing it, and our application development isn't there yet. Mm-hmm. There's a real challenge to get the security built into the pieces of code that they're running that can adapt for the fact that they're running in new modes of support. Right. And then the last thing is just real challenge is kind of staff retention. Right. In this market, it's very hard to find and keep good people. Typically as you get them brought on board and up to speed, they're now worth more. They're
now more marketable.
They can take it elsewhere.
Yeah. No, that's always been a problem in the cyber field. Now, luckily the schools. I taught the subject for 17 years at the graduate level. The schools. And the classes are all sold out immediately. So, hopefully there's another generation coming along that will hopefully be able to address that. And I guess, in a way, if you're if a stint in the government and you do some work in the government and then you go to the private sector, you're really going to be helping the government anyway. So maybe in the long run, we're all one big happy workforce. Let's go. Ed White, what do you think are some of the big, real tough challenges yet to be overcome to get where we want to go?
I think the first one, probably, and the most interesting one, would probably be the changed use and capabilities of cyber technology as they're being done, right? Intelligence, for example, intelligence and defense agencies are becoming to realize that technologies are critical to their mission, right? To do intelligence gathering, to do whatever it is that they need to do, right? But it's also a serious threat to their operational side. Right? So it's important for them to use the technologies, but now it's a double-edged sword because it's a threat associated to be using against them, right? And it's becoming more and more a daily occurrence, right? The pendulum is swung now to be more attack versus defense. And now you have to contend how to use the capabilities for good and how to use the capabilities for a different purpose. The second point I'd say would be the technology is moving faster than policy, legislation, and regulation can actually catch up to it, right? So there's been an evolution in terms to use for cybersecurity considerations. What do you mean by cyber war? What do you mean by cyber terrorism, right? If these things are not actually taken in consideration and a common taxonomy is brought forward, whether that be for U.S. government or the whole world, right, we're never going to be able to get this really under control because we actually can't do anything unless we're all talking the same terms, and we can't act upon things without the ability in which to act upon them based upon what those terms are defined as. And the last point is in similar kind of to take off of Ron's comment around, you got to correctly weigh the risks versus the returns of gathering a greater reliance on using the cloud or the internet, if you will, to provide critical functions, right? The exponential increase in severity of cyber threats can be closely linked to the increase in connectivity the world is encountering, right? There's more people on the internet, there's more people have the ability to do what they need to do, whether it be for good or for bad. And as it currently stands, mission critical systems can by and large continue to function if they're degraded, right? But as we move those mission-critical systems to a large-scale system, for example, to a super-scale activities for government or industry or the broader community of interest, you have to weigh those potential efficiencies and economic returns against the fact that consolidating those systems' architecture is exponentially more vulnerable to cyber attacks than standalone or small, protected systems. Now, whether or not you can architect the larger systems to protect yourself appropriately isn't a complete different discussion, and we could probably have a long, drawn-out discussion over that. However, it is something that you have to worry about and, in turn, put forward some sort of mitigation to determine how those risks are going to be viewed.
Good point. Very good point. David Egts, what do you think in terms of some of the challenges out there, or the things that still need to be overcome to get where we need to be?
Yeah, so some of the challenges that we are working on is continuing to dispel the myth that being closed is the best way to do security.
Right.
And just like you have peer-reviewed science or anything else, we believe that being open and being able to play our cards face up is the best way to build the best and most secure software possible. People wouldn't buy a pack of hot dogs if they couldn't read the ingredients on the label.
Right.
But why are we buying software? Where we don't know what's inside.
Can't see the bits.
Yeah, so that's one thing, but I see that openness, that responsibility is not just on the private sector in terms of the software providers, but it's also within the government in terms of sharing CNA information between each other. Like, how many times has a government entity done certification of a web server that's running Linux? Probably thousands and thousands of times independently.
Right. So we need some type of clearinghouse to share that information so that we're not redoing the same thing over and over again.
That's right, and that's a lot of the work that NIST is doing with FedRAMP is helping to do that. And I think that's a great step in the right direction, and we're making a lot of progress there. But and I think that people are starting to get the idea that innovation happens when sharing happens, and so to have this clearinghouse of best practices is very good. And the other things that we're doing as well is, going back to my point earlier about it could be an IT person, it could be somebody in the battlefield who may not be a security professional. Having a community that they can fall back on to find out those best practices is important too. So, with FedRAMP, there are other initiatives like MilOSS, and there are other ones that Red Hat is running, such as our Trusted Computing project. We have a project called Aqueduct for locking down Red Hat-based systems, and we also have a GovSec mailing list, which is a way for people to say, hey, give me some help. And it's not just you calling Red Hat and then you're actually talking to like-minded people throughout the community, and somebody who may reply may be another Govy that's like, yeah, this is the way I did it and it works great for me. Yeah,
you're right. You're exactly right about having people when you think about cybersecurity, not everybody's going to understand the issues. You're going to have you're going to rely on your end user, the person out there in the field with the portable device, going to have a certain sense of responsibility also to protect systems and information. Sam, Chun, what do you think are some of the big challenges that you still see that things we got to get done in order to feel confident that we're getting to where we want to be with securing our data?
So, Jim, when I have those questions, I go to our HP lab scientists because they're responsible for really thinking through the big challenges and working across HP to figure out some solutions. The two big areas in security that really excite me are first around security analytics. In other industries, decisions that are made based on risk are a lot more rigorous and a lot more robust, especially in the insurance industry where they take your profile of who you are, your health background, your family history, and able to have an entire group of people called actuaries that determine your risk profile and assign financials based to it. In IT, we don't make decisions that way. A lot of it's gut-based. If you ask agency leaders, do you think based on your risk profile, are you over or underspending on cybersecurity? The answer is very mixed, and that's mainly because there are no real tools, technologies, and really mathematical rigor in trying to help them make that decision. So that's a big challenge to overcome. How do we allow CIOs and Chief Information Security Officers evaluate what their risk profile is at a real rigorous level and what the appropriate amount of spend is? The second thing is control portfolio optimization. It's a lot of words again. But real basically, if you want to take a practical example, is when I have a home project, I love to run to Home Depot and buy more tools. And they do it every time. And my wife is always saying, why don't you look at the tools you have, figure out the optimum combination, and work on your project. And I think that's a lot of that happens in security.
Right.
We buy tons of tools.
No doubt.
And the rigor we use to configure them in a way that optimizes their effect in defending the enterprise, that isn't there. So those are two big programs that HP Labs is working on, I think will be real value to agency leaders.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it's been a Band-Aid approach for a long, long time, and there's all kinds of fixes in place. Someone has to step back and look at it breadth first. The whole breadth of the system, where are the real vulnerabilities and what is, sort of a holistic approach as opposed to, I kid all the time, it's disappointing that the word firewall even exists. Because if systems were built to be secure in the first place, we wouldn't have to have a firewall to secure them. But anyway, we're going to shift the subjects again, but before we do that, we need to take a short break. You're listening to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM. Welcome back to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM. I'm Jim Flyzik here with Chris Lowe from USDA, Dr. Ron Ross from NIST, Sam Chun from HP, Ed White from McAfee, and David Egts from Red Hat. We're talking cybersecurity. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. We've been talking about the government and government programs, but when you think of cybersecurity, there's so much interconnectivity with the private sector, and there's so much private sector involvement. In many cases, if you're talking public cloud, the private sector may be managing the government's information. So let's talk about the role of the private sector. What should that role be, and how are companies and government more effectively sharing expertise and best practices and working together? Let's start with Ron Ross at NIST, because Ron, I would think NIST is a key player in trying to work with the private sector. Can you talk a little bit to that issue?
Sure, Jim. Well, NIST being part of the Department of Commerce, we have a kind of a special relationship. We do cybersecurity for the federal government, but we also have a very close connection to industry, and we try to work with industry all the time. When you look at the advanced persistent threats and some of the really sophisticated types of cyber attacks we're experiencing today, this becomes both a national security and an economic security issue for both the public and private sector. The attacks are hitting both sectors equally hard, and it really will have a long-term debilitating effect on our national and economic security interests, especially with regard to not just bringing down capability, but this whole notion of exfiltration, stealing intellectual property
Sure.
from some of our great companies. So the private sector, the critical infrastructure is 90% owned and operated by private sector and state and locals. So if we're going to have a holistic solution to our cybersecurity challenges and problems, we have to have a very close partnership with the public and private sector. And you've heard today some of the companies represented here today. It's all about innovation.
Right.
When you have tough challenges, we've always been able to innovate our way into good solutions, and that always comes from the private sector, and I think that's the strengthening of the partnership. We do a lot of outreach activities with state and locals, private sector companies. That has to continue to be strengthened. The ISACs, information sharing, really looking at this as more of a team effort. I think that's the real long-term solution.
Yeah, right. I mean, I agree with you. I think in the past, it seems like something bad would happen and then people take it serious.
Right.
But I think now that there's been enough bad things causing bad press that people are getting more proactive, saying, well,
Visibility
let's
is
make sure it doesn't happen to us.
Exactly.
Chris Lowe, how about from an agency point of view, like at Department of Ag, how would you coordinate, or what role would the private sector be playing in assisting you in trying to get things done?
Well, there's a couple of levels to that, right? There's the business partner, private sector, who are program implementers and partners. For them, the data
We're trying to protect is really, their operational data, and the challenge there is to get them to know when and how and what is important. It may not be an obvious issue to them, but it is, it can be the lead up to a persistent threat or some other sort of attack. Getting them comfortable to let us know things are happening and that there's not going to be some punitive reaction is a very vital part of building that relationship. The other is more from a technology standpoint, the partnerships we have there, getting the requirements of what we're after into those vehicles, into those arrangements. I alluded to the sensor array we built before. That was a great example where we had our analyst vendor who would come work with us to develop the requirements for what their dream tool set would be. We had our PMO vendor who worked a very competitive performance-based vehicle to put it out. And then the prime that actually won worked with a whole set of vendors to make them integrate the solution set and give us back, a turnkey set of tools rather than, buy a box, hope it works,
Right.
and, knock them down one at a time. So end to end, we just had this terrific, collaborative effort that really, it moved us years ahead of where we started from.
Yeah. And then when you think of the general public, I think the general public, if an agency's reputation is enhanced and being seen as securing information, the general public will have a lot more confidence to work with that agency and share information and so forth. So important things. Sam, Chun, what do you think is the role of the private sector? How does like a private sector company like HP, when you're working with government and perhaps the government is using a lot of private sector tools, and how do you see that, the role working themselves out there?
So there's a lot that HP does with the government in terms of really tactically helping secure our customers that are in the private sector. One of the unique things about HP is that not only are we a full portfolio technology provider, but we also manage some of the largest enterprises on behalf of Fortune 500 companies. And a lot of the Fortune 500 private organizations, they don't really own or operate their own IT. They have companies that do it for them, the managed service providers. So one of the key things that we look for in government is the government has some of the most really tactically helpful threat information that exists out there. Mm-hmm. We have our own threat intelligence system through our own acquisitions and capabilities. We're really getting that in the know government information that says this is a threat that's going to impact your customer. Let's get together, or here's something you can work with. That is just beginning at DHS. I just met with some folks at DHS a couple weeks ago, and the information sharing program for cyber is expanding into critical infrastructure sectors, financial services being one of the first. And we're very excited about those programs because it really helps us work with government to protect our private industry customers.
Right. Ed, anything you can add to this in terms of a role of a private sector?
I would say that both Ron and Sam have been spot on with respects to that. I think, McAfee is an ardent believer that information sharing is a key to successful prevention. We can't do it alone. We know that we're going to need to interoperate and and take information from other entities, whether it be private industry and tools, or whether it be government that has specific information about threats that are targeting on their side of the house. So I think that we're not going to shine any new light on it. We think that the public-private partnership has been growing steadily over the last 1.5 to 2 years. We've been engaged in it for quite some time, and we look forward to supporting it.
Yeah, terrific. I know we have the whole, I know, Ron, you're aware of the National Strategy for Trusted Internet Credentials. That's a whole nother area which will address the private sector. And in fact, we're going to have a show not too distant future on identity management and focus on some of those issues associated with it. David, Egts, I'm going to come to you now, but because we're down to our last 10 minutes, I'm going to change the question a little bit around. I want to change the dialogue here and start thinking to the future. Start thinking about where this is all going. And are we going to get to a point where we are proactive enough to get out in front of these threats and cyber attacks? You know, I've heard people say, yeah, we're heading to someday we're going to have digital Pearl Harbor and all kinds of things. I have others say, no, that's a bunch of hype. And I have others say, you know, my question for all of you to think about in our last couple of is, what's the future look like to you? Are we going to get to a point where we feel like we can relax a little bit because we feel like we have secure systems, or are we always going to be in the catch-up mode or whatever? David, what's your thoughts? What's your crystal ball say on all this?
Yeah, so by nature I'm an optimist, and I, you know, but the reality sets in that there is no computer that you could, or software that you could design that is completely secure, completely hacker-proof. The best you could hope for is hacker-resistant. And so, you know, and the other part too is that crime has been around and war has been around for thousands of years, well before the computer was even invented, and it'll be around for thousands of years to come. And so what I think what we really need to focus on is, just building the castle walls high enough to make it not compelling for a potential adversary to come and go after certain things. But the problem there is that if I build my castle wall high enough, they're going to go and attack the next castle.
Right.
And so the thing is, we need to work together as a community to share best practices, whether it's public sector or private sector, to work together to figure out what are the best ingredients to build these walls,
right,
and how do we put them together the best way. And then especially as we start looking at cloud computing, where we're putting all our eggs in one basket, the way we built baskets, we got to change. We need to build a better basket. And so a lot of the things that Red Hat is doing with our cloud security initiatives, with SVERT and our extending our SE Linux work to address that, are things that we're working to help strengthen those castle walls.
Yeah, terrific. I like that. The castle wall, the analogy is pretty good. It was like the border security fence. Someone said, show me a 10-foot fence, and someone will have a 12-foot ladder. I mean, that's just Christopher Lowe, USDA. What do you see down the road when you think out, years out in front? What kind of environment do you see? You feel, you're going to get to where you need to be?
Well, I think David made a couple strong points there that, yeah, there's always going to be the threat. I think we're going to greatly improve the walls of the castle, to abuse the analogy. I think one of our challenges is going to be also that we're going to educate the people inside the castle. At the end of the day, a lot of the very successful attacks are focused on the people. And part of our challenge as security professionals is to come up with that way to help them understand better what they do. USDA has, for example, a food safety hotline. Anyone in America can call and ask whatever kind of general question they have about cooking the burgers on their table.
Right.
When we can get security to be that same kind of ease of access, that people know what to ask, or at least know where to go for it, I think we'll be far ahead of where we are today.
I think that's an excellent point, to focus on the human side of it, because last time I researched this, when I was still teaching it, still the highest percentage of problems it comes from in most cases, mistakes or errors or omissions, or somebody accidentally takes a thumb drive home, or somebody accidentally loses a computer. So the human side of it is an excellent thing. Chris, thanks for entering that into the conversation. Sam Chun, what do you see? What's it look like down the road to you, Sam?
So I have to be somewhat careful because when I make these predictions in the future, and future's here, and if they don't pan out, I have to eat my words. I am, by the way, one of those guys.
Don't worry about it. It's just on radio.
I think in the future, we've already starting to see this. We're making huge inroads in technology assurance. I think technology has gotten a lot more secure out of the gate than it has been in the past. Efforts like the vulnerability and weakness enumerations that have been worked on by NIST and then on some other organizations are critically important in driving out some of these problems that the threats prey on. So I think over time, in the future, we're going to have technology infrastructures that are a lot more resilient, a lot more secure. Will it prevent the digital Pearl Harbors that you referred to? I'm not sure, but I know if we actually make progress in these efforts, that the possibility becomes less and less, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Appreciate that. Ed Waite, what do you see as you think down the road as to where all this may be going, and what's your future look like? Are we going to be out in front of this stuff? Are we going to be here 5 years from now doing a radio show talking about trying to catch up and get security to meet the new technologies?
I sure hope not. I do believe that we're approaching a time when the response to cyber attacks will have to be carried out without human intervention, or in real time, or at least near real time. I don't think you're going to be able to do it with people. People are just not fast enough, right? So we'll have to put policy and controls in place across the board, whether it be standards or whether it be just policies and controls within the technical solutions that we're putting forward that are robust enough to allow action by security programs to actually do what they need to do to take that action to protect the castle walls, if you will, right? It's no longer enough to detect and deter, right? You have to have the broader community of government and industry and to be perfectly honest, the world, working together to weed out the weaknesses and strengthen the security architecture as a whole. If things go more and more to the cloud, as obviously they seem to be migrating towards, we're no longer just an island on our own. We actually have to be able to take in consideration the broader community.
Yeah, I think that's interesting with the public-private cloud, and as we look at public cloud, it's going to change the risk responsibility of the contractors. Now, I don't think the government people are going to be able to say, okay, it's all your issue now, but it's certainly going to be a much more shared responsibility now, and service level agreements are going to have to be refocused on with a lot of security in mind and security metrics and performance metrics. Ron Ross at NIST, I would think NIST, just by its very nature, would be an agency that needs to think about the future and needs to think about where things are going to try to stay ahead of the curve and be a leader in that area. What's your crystal ball look like? What's the future look like for you?
Well, I think it's a combination. For me, the vision for the future really kind of has two parts. Going back to what was described earlier, the sophisticated cyber attacks that we're experiencing now, I think we really have to go back, in some sense, back to the future and recapture some of the fundamentals that we've known for decades. Good security engineering, good security architectures, those are the fundamentals that really allow us to have more resilient systems. And, the level of attacks we see today where you have capabilities, intentions, and resources and targeting capabilities of adversaries, we've got to be able to defend against the vast majority of the attacks that are occurring. But as someone said earlier, I think it was David that talked about a certain percentage of these attacks get through. When that happens, that's where the real vision for the future kicks in. We've got to be able to have the systems and the infrastructure churn at a rate that even though the systems have been penetrated, the adversary's time on target is so limited that they can't do any damage. So through virtualization techniques and some of the new technologies that are being discussed today, we have the ability to, even when those attacks do occur, the systems are changing at a rapid pace, so you go back to a known secure state, and then the malware really, in essence, can disappear. That's the longer-term view, but it really does start with the fundamentals. Like my football coach used to say, blocking and tackling is the start, and you can develop the fancy plays later, but let's don't forget the fundamentals first.
Yeah, terrific. Well said, Ron. Let me try to come up with some summary points here, try to wrap this up, the kinds of things that we talked about and I heard here. We started the discussion talking about the feeling that we're becoming more proactive, that the Band-Aid approach in the past does not work in the future, and it's costly, and we need to be standardized on a lot of things. We talked about changing the conversation from more of a talking about bits and bytes and IT security to more talking about managing risk, things that senior executives can more relate to. We talked a lot about the need for common operating platforms. The more we can work and move towards common operating platforms, the better the chance for being able to have security solutions that address common areas. The certification and accreditation process remains a challenge in terms of getting things done quick. Technology changes fast, and we need to be able to get the technology deployed, which means it's going to have to be certified and accredited to be deployed much faster in the future than in the past. We talked about cloud and virtualization as being two interesting security challenges, but the fact that they are being addressed, and in some cases they offer a new opportunity to look at the breadth of security versus individual pieces, because we're moving things to the cloud, we can now look at the whole big picture of how we can do that. A difficult word to say, but operationalizing security became a challenge, and that's where we want to go, to really get to the point to where we're operationalizing security. The complexity is always there. We said in the future we'll never solve every threat and vulnerability, but I like what Dr. Ross said here, the resilient issue. If you can quickly go back to a pre-state prior to the attack occurring, you can do that very quickly. You can minimize the damages done by any particular attack. So yeah, another great conversation. I want to turn it now and thank all of our panelists for taking time from your busy day. I know you all have extremely important jobs, so I appreciate you taking time to come down and share some of these best practices with us. I also want to thank our sponsors for sponsoring the show. Without the sponsors, we wouldn't be able to do this. And of course, WTOP, WFED, who do such a good job putting the show on. And most importantly, thanks to our listening audience out there. Thank you for listening to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM.